Welcome, my friend, and thank you for joining me as we embark on a slow and peaceful journey through the history of trains. Tonight, there is no need to rush. No crowded station platforms, no whistles urging us to hurry aboard, and no timetables to keep. Instead, we'll travel at a gentle pace, following iron rails that stretch across centuries, winding through quiet villages, misty valleys, towering mountains, and bustling cities as they slowly transform before our eyes. Before we begin, I invite you to settle in somewhere comfortable. Perhaps dim the lights, pull a blanket a little closer, and allow the rhythm of this story to become as steady and soothing as the sound of wheels rolling across the tracks. If you happen to drift off along the way, that's perfectly all right. The trains will continue their journey, patiently waiting whenever you're ready to return. For most of human history, traveling even a short distance was an adventure that demanded time, endurance, and no small amount of patience. Roads were often little more than muddy paths. Wagons lurched over ruts and stones. Horses tired quickly, and long journeys could take weeks or even months. Entire communities lived their lives never venturing more than a few miles from the place where they were born. It is difficult for us today to imagine such a world. We think very little of traveling hundreds of miles in a single afternoon. Yet only a few centuries ago, the idea of gliding effortlessly across a countryside at what seemed like unimaginable speed would have sounded like something from a work of fantasy. Then, little by little, everything began to change. The story of trains is not simply the story of machines. It is also the story of curious inventors, determined engineers, hard-working laborers, ambitious dreamers, and ordinary travelers who found themselves living through one of history's greatest transformations. It is the story of quiet mining villages where wooden rails first appeared beneath heavy wagons. It is the story of blacksmiths experimenting with iron wheels, mechanics covered in soot, and builders carving tunnels through mountains that many believed could never be crossed. It is also a story about people, about families waiting on station platforms, about conductors carefully checking tickets beneath glowing lanterns, about children pressing their faces against carriage windows to watch forests, rivers, and distant farms drift slowly past, about workers heading to cities they had never seen before, about letters arriving in days instead of months, about goods that once traveled only as fast as a walking horse suddenly crossing entire countries with astonishing speed. As we move through the centuries together, we'll discover how something as simple as two parallel rails quietly reshaped the modern world. We'll visit the smoky workshops of the Industrial Revolution, where steam engines first came alive with hissing valves and spinning wheels. We'll stand beside early locomotives as curious crowds gather to witness these noisy iron machines. We'll travel through the great railway boom of Britain, where new tracks spread across green countryside almost faster than anyone could count. From there, our journey will continue across oceans and continents. We'll follow surveyors into rugged mountains, watch bridges rise over deep valleys, and witness railroads stretching across vast deserts and endless plains. We'll meet the workers whose steady hands laid countless miles of track, often in difficult conditions, connecting places that had once seemed impossibly far apart. But our journey won't only focus on grand achievements or famous names. Some of the most interesting moments in railway history are surprisingly ordinary. We'll spend time inside cozy station waiting rooms where clocks tick softly above polished wooden benches. We'll stroll through bustling platforms filled with travelers carrying leather suitcases and wrapped parcels. We'll listen to the gentle conversations of dining car passengers enjoying warm meals while rolling through peaceful countryside. We'll explore the quiet routines of signal operators, telegraph clerks, sleeping car attendants, and station masters whose daily work kept thousands of trains moving safely. Along the way, we'll ride aboard elegant luxury expresses, humble commuter trains, mountain railways that seem to cling impossibly to cliff sides, and modern high-speed trains that glide almost silently across the landscape. We'll discover how railroads changed cities, transformed industries, encouraged new towns to grow, and brought distant places just a little closer together. And throughout it all, we'll return again and again to one simple sound: the steady rhythm of wheels upon the rails. Click-clack, click-clack. For nearly 2 centuries, that quiet rhythm has carried millions of people toward new homes, new opportunities, long-awaited reunions, and unforgettable adventures. It has become one of the most familiar sounds in human history, steady, comforting, and almost hypnotic. Perhaps that is one reason so many people find trains so relaxing. There is something timeless about watching the landscape drift by from a comfortable seat while the world outside moves at its own unhurried pace. Fields give way to forests. Rivers slip beneath bridges. Small stations appear and disappear. The horizon slowly changes, mile after mile, requiring nothing from us except quiet observation. So tonight, we will do exactly that. We will slow down. We will leave behind the noise of the present for a little while and follow the rails back through history, discovering how one remarkable invention connected continents, transformed everyday life, and changed the way humanity experienced distance itself. Our train is waiting. The lanterns have been lit. The engineer has checked the gauges. A soft plume of steam drifts into the cool evening air as the whistle echoes gently across the platform. Please step aboard. Find a comfortable seat by the window. Our long, peaceful journey through the history of trains is about to begin. As our train gently leaves the station, let us imagine something rather unusual. With the steady rhythm of wheels beneath us, picture the rails slowly fading away. The polished steel disappears into the earth. The locomotive grows quiet, and before long, there is no railroad at all. Instead, we find ourselves standing on a country road more than 300 years ago, in a world where trains have not yet been imagined. The morning is cool and still. A light mist hangs over the fields, and the only sounds are birds greeting the sunrise and the distant clip-clop of horses making their way along a winding dirt road. For nearly all of human history, this was the soundtrack of travel. People certainly moved from place to place, but they did so slowly. Walking remained the most common way to journey, whether traveling to a neighboring village, tending distant fields, or visiting a local market. A healthy person might cover 15 or 20 miles in a day on foot, though doing so required both time and determination. For those fortunate enough to own a horse, travel could be somewhat quicker, but horses required food, water, shelter, and constant care. They tired easily when carrying heavy loads and needed frequent rest. Even the wealthiest travelers found that nature, weather, and rough roads often determined the pace more than ambition ever could. Roads themselves were another challenge. Many were little more than worn paths that had gradually widened through generations of use. After heavy rain, wagons became trapped in deep mud. During dry summers, thick clouds of dust followed every passing cart. Winter brought frozen ruts that rattled wheels and passengers alike. Even roads considered excellent by the standards of the day would seem remarkably uneven to modern travelers. Imagine climbing aboard a stagecoach in 18th-century England. The carriage rocks from side to side as wooden wheels strike every stone and rut beneath them. Leather straps suspend the coach instead of springs, softening only the harshest jolts. Passengers squeeze together beneath blankets, while luggage is tied securely to the roof. The journey begins before sunrise. Horses pull steadily through villages and open countryside, stopping every dozen miles or so to be exchanged for fresh teams waiting at coaching inns. Travelers stretch stiff legs while stable hands quickly unhitch tired horses and harness new ones with practiced efficiency. The coach continues onward. Hour after hour, day after day. A journey that today might take only a few hours could easily require several days, assuming favorable weather and no broken wheels. Traveling was rarely spontaneous. Most people simply stayed close to home because leaving required careful planning, considerable expense, and plenty of patience. Entire lives unfolded within a relatively small corner of the world. A farmer might know every field, stream, and woodland for miles around, yet never see the capital city of his own country. News traveled just as slowly. Letters were carried on horseback or by coach, moving from town to town as quickly as roads allowed. A message announcing a birth, a wedding, or important business might take weeks to arrive. By the time news reached distant places, events themselves often felt like old memories. Goods faced similar obstacles. A wagon loaded with grain, timber, or barrels of ale could carry impressive weight, but every extra pound made the horses work harder. Steep hills often required additional animals simply to pull heavy loads uphill. On especially difficult roads, drivers sometimes unloaded part of the cargo, carried it separately, and returned for the remainder. Transporting goods over long distances was expensive. As a result, many communities relied heavily on whatever could be produced nearby. Local farms supplied local markets. Local forests provided building timber. Stone was usually quarried close to where it would be used. Distance added cost to nearly everything. Whenever possible, people preferred another route altogether. Rivers had long served as nature's highways. Boats could carry far heavier cargo than wagons, requiring much less effort. A single barge drifting along a calm river could transport dozens of tons that would otherwise require many horses and wagons. Canals became increasingly important for the same reason. Beginning in the 17th and 18th centuries, engineers dug long artificial waterways connecting rivers, towns, and growing industrial centers. Narrowboats, pulled gently by horses walking along towpaths, glided almost silently across the landscape. Though hardly fast, canal transport was dependable. A horse that struggled to pull one heavy wagon over rough roads could effortlessly tow several fully loaded boats through calm water. Coal, bricks, grain, and manufactured goods floated steadily from one community to another, helping commerce grow long before railroads appeared. Even so, canals had limitations. They could not climb mountains. Rivers did not always flow where people wished to travel. During harsh winters, ice sometimes halted movement altogether. Communities located far from waterways still depended upon muddy roads and weary horses. The world was growing busier. Cities expanded. Factories multiplied. Mines produced ever greater quantities of coal and iron. Merchants searched for faster ways to move people and products across increasingly crowded nations. The old methods, reliable though they had been for centuries, were beginning to show their limits. Few people yet realized it, but the search for better transportation had already begun in unexpected places. Not in great cities, not in royal palaces, but deep beneath the ground, inside dark coal mines where workers faced a surprisingly familiar problem. How could something heavy be moved just a little more easily? The answer would begin with simple wooden rails laid across damp earth, where horses pulled loaded wagons with far less effort than before. Those humble tracks looked nothing like the railways we know today. Yet from those quiet beginnings, an extraordinary journey was about to unfold, and with it, the age of trains would slowly come into view. As we left the last chapter, we found ourselves standing at the edge of a coal mine, far from the grand stations and elegant locomotives that would one day define the railway age. At first glance, it may seem like an unlikely place for one of history's greatest transportation revolutions to begin. There are no polished brass locomotives here, no whistles echoing across the countryside, no passengers carrying leather suitcases or conductors calling out departures. Instead, there is only hard work. The morning air is cool, but the mine itself is alive with activity. Miners emerge from the darkness with soot-covered faces, their lanterns flickering in the dim light. Nearby, horses patiently wait beside heavy wooden carts overflowing with freshly dug coal. Coal was becoming increasingly valuable throughout Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries. Homes needed it for warmth, blacksmiths depended upon it for their forges, and growing industries required more fuel than forests alone could provide. Every year, mines reached a little deeper into the earth, producing greater amounts of coal than ever before. But digging coal was only half the challenge. Once it reached the surface, someone had to move it. A wagon loaded with coal could weigh several tons. Pulling such enormous weight across rough, muddy ground demanded tremendous effort, even for the strongest horses. Wheels sank into soft earth. Carts became stuck in deep ruts. Every journey from the mine to a nearby river or marketplace consumed precious time and energy. Mine owners began searching for a simple solution. What if the wagons always followed the same path? Instead of allowing wheels to cut deeper into the mud every day, workers laid long wooden beams across the ground. These beams formed narrow tracks that guided the wagon wheels in a straight line. It was an elegant idea. The wooden rails created a smoother surface than bare earth, reducing friction and helping prevent wheels from sinking into the mud. Suddenly, a single horse could pull significantly heavier loads than before. The difference surprised everyone. Without becoming any stronger, the horse itself seemed almost transformed simply because the ground beneath the wagon had changed. These early tracks became known as wagonways. By modern standards, they were remarkably simple. Thick wooden timbers rested directly on the ground or upon short supports. Wagons rolled along them using ordinary wooden wheels. There were no steel rails, no railroad ties carefully measured to precise spacing, and certainly no locomotives. Yet the basic idea was already there. Guide the wheels. Reduce resistance. Make heavy loads easier to move. Sometimes the most revolutionary inventions begin with surprisingly modest improvements. As more mines adopted wagonways, another interesting problem appeared. Occasionally, wagon wheels slipped off the wooden rails, especially around bends or uneven sections of track. Every derailment meant stopping work while laborers struggled to lift heavy carts back into position. Inventors soon experimented with different wheel designs. Some wagons used wheels with raised edges, known today as flanges, that helped keep them aligned on the rails. Others built the raised edge into the rail itself instead. Both approaches aimed to solve the same simple problem, keeping wagons moving smoothly without wandering off their path. These experiments may have seemed insignificant at the time, but they established one of the defining features of rail transportation. Even today, modern train wheels still rely upon carefully designed flanges to remain securely on the track. The mines themselves were busy, noisy places. Throughout the day, horses steadily hauled loaded wagons toward rivers, ports, or storage yards before returning with empty carts to begin the journey again. Drivers learned every bend in the track. Carpenters regularly replaced worn sections of timber. Blacksmiths repaired broken wheels, while laborers cleared mud and debris after storms. It was demanding work, but it followed a comforting rhythm. Load the wagon. Lead the horse. Follow the rails. Unload. Turn around. Repeat. Day after day. Season after season. Although wagonways first appeared around mines, they gradually spread elsewhere as people recognized their usefulness. Quarries adopted them to move heavy blocks of stone. Ironworks used them to transport raw materials between workshops. Busy industrial sites discovered that fixed tracks offered a reliable way to move large quantities of goods with less effort. The idea itself was quietly gaining momentum. Meanwhile, another material was beginning to replace wood: iron. Wooden rails worked well enough, but constant use wore them down. Heavy wagons gradually carved grooves into the timber, while rain, frost, and insects weakened the wood over time. Repairs were frequent, and entire sections often required replacement. Iron offered a more durable alternative. At first, thin iron plates were fastened onto wooden rails, creating a tougher surface for the wheels to roll across. These plateways, as they became known, lasted longer and supported heavier loads. Eventually, engineers began producing rails made almost entirely of iron. Though expensive, they proved stronger, smoother, and far more reliable than wood. Few people could have guessed that these simple improvements would one day support trains weighing hundreds of tons and traveling at astonishing speeds. Yet each small innovation built upon the last. A smoother track, a stronger rail, a better wheel. None of these changes seemed world-changing on their own. Together, however, they were quietly preparing the foundation for something entirely new. Still, one important limitation remained: the horses. No matter how efficient the tracks became, every wagon still depended upon animals that needed food, water, rest, and care. A horse could work only so many hours in a day before growing tired. As industries expanded, mine owners dreamed of moving even greater amounts of coal with less effort. If only the wagons could pull themselves. It sounded impossible. But elsewhere in Britain, curious inventors were already experimenting with a remarkable new source of power. Their machines hissed with steam, pumped water from deep mines, and hinted at possibilities few people yet understood. Before long, someone would wonder whether that same power might move not just pumps, but entire trains. And with that simple question, the next chapter of railway history was ready to begin. As we leave the quiet wagons behind, let us travel a little farther into 18th-century Britain, where the air carries the scent of coal smoke and the steady sound of industry is becoming impossible to ignore. The world is changing. In villages that had once been peaceful and slow-moving, new workshops are appearing. Water wheels turn beside rivers. Blacksmiths work longer hours than ever before. Mines grow deeper each year, searching for the coal that fuels homes, factories, and furnaces. Everywhere, people are looking for ways to accomplish more work with less effort. Yet one stubborn problem continues to trouble nearly every coal mine: water. The deeper miners dig beneath the earth, the more groundwater seeps into the tunnels. For centuries, removing this water had been exhausting work. Laborers carried buckets to the surface by hand, while horses turned large pumps that labored day and night. These methods worked, but only up to a point. As mines reached greater depths, they needed something far more powerful. That need inspired one of history's most important inventions. In 1712, an English inventor named Thomas Newcomen built what is widely recognized as the first practical steam engine. By modern standards, Newcomen's machine was enormous, noisy, and surprisingly inefficient. It was certainly nothing like the sleek locomotives that would later race across the countryside. In fact, it never moved at all. The engine remained fixed in one place, usually beside a mine, where it spent its days pumping water rather than carrying passengers. Even so, those who watched it at work could hardly fail to be impressed. A great iron boiler heated water until it became steam. That steam filled a large cylinder, where a piston slowly rose and fell. Through an ingenious arrangement of beams and rods, each movement of the piston powered a pump deep below the surface. The motion repeated over and over. Steam, lift, release, pump, again, and again. It was slow, almost hypnotic to watch, yet it accomplished work that would have required countless laborers and horses. Before long, Newcomen engines appeared at mines across Britain. They solved one problem remarkably well, but they created another. They consumed astonishing amounts of coal. Fortunately for mine owners, coal was exactly what they were producing. Still, many inventors believed there had to be a better way. One of those inventors was a Scottish instrument maker named James Watt. In the 1760s, Watt was asked to repair a model of a Newcomen engine. As he carefully examined its moving parts, he noticed something important. The engine wasted tremendous amounts of heat. Each cycle required the cylinder to be heated with steam and then cooled again almost immediately. Much of the energy disappeared during this constant heating and cooling. Watt wondered whether the steam could be condensed somewhere else instead. After years of careful experimentation, he developed a separate condenser that allowed the main cylinder to remain hot while the steam cooled elsewhere. It was a simple idea in principle, but it dramatically improved the engine's efficiency. The new design used far less fuel while producing more useful power. It was one of those rare improvements that quietly changed everything. Soon, Watt and his business partner Matthew Boulton began producing improved steam engines for factories, mills, and mines throughout Britain. These engines no longer served only one purpose. They powered textile mills where spinning machines produced cloth faster than ever before. They operated hammers in ironworks, ground grain in mills, and assisted countless workshops that had once relied entirely upon human strength, horses, or flowing rivers. Steam was becoming a dependable source of power. Unlike a water wheel, it did not require a nearby river. Unlike a horse, it never needed sleep. As long as there was fuel for the fire and water for the boiler, the engine could continue working hour after hour. Britain was entering what historians now call the Industrial Revolution. Factories expanded rapidly. Towns grew into busy cities. Coal mines dug deeper, iron foundries produced stronger metals, and workshops developed better tools with remarkable speed. The pace of everyday life began to change. Yet despite all these advances, transportation still lagged behind. Factories could manufacture goods more quickly than ever before, but moving those goods remained slow. Canals carried heavy cargo efficiently, and wagonways helped around mines, yet horses still did most of the hauling on land. Steam had transformed industry. Could it also transform travel? At first, many people doubted the idea. Steam engines were massive machines, often weighing several tons. Their boilers were large, their moving beams cumbersome, and their operation seemed far too awkward for anything that needed to travel. But inventors are rarely discouraged by difficult questions. Instead, they begin asking smaller ones. What if the engine were lighter? What if its parts could be made stronger? What if iron could replace heavy wooden beams? What if the engine itself could ride upon rails instead of remaining fixed beside a mine? These questions slowly spread among engineers and mechanics across Britain. Some sketched ideas in notebooks. Others built tiny working models. Many failed. A few succeeded just enough to encourage the next attempt. Progress did not happen overnight. It arrived one careful improvement at a time. A better boiler, a stronger cylinder, a more reliable valve, a lighter frame. Each invention rested quietly upon those that had come before it. Meanwhile, the wagonways we visited in the previous chapter continued carrying coal every day. Horses faithfully pulled heavy carts along wooden and iron rails, unaware that their long partnership with transportation was beginning to draw to a close. Somewhere, perhaps in a small workshop filled with the smell of hot iron and coal smoke, an engineer looked at those familiar tracks and imagined something extraordinary. Not horses, steam, not walking, rolling, not merely pumping water from beneath the earth, but carrying people and goods across the countryside under the power of an engine unlike anything the world had ever seen. The age of the steam locomotive was still just over the horizon. But with every improvement in steam power, that remarkable future came a little closer, and before long, one determined engineer would prove that the impossible could, indeed, run on rails. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, Britain was humming with new ideas. Steam engines had become more capable, mines were producing record amounts of coal, and iron rails were steadily replacing the old wooden wagonways. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together. Now someone needed to assemble them. That person would be George Stephenson. Stephenson was born in 1781 in the small village of Wylam, in northern England. His family was not wealthy. His father worked tending the steam engines that pumped water from nearby coal mines, and from an early age George became fascinated by the great machines that hissed, clanked, and groaned through the day. Unlike many famous inventors, Stephenson received very little formal education as a child. He worked from a young age, caring for livestock, repairing machinery, and eventually finding employment in the local mines. In fact, he did not learn to read and write until he was an adult, attending evening classes after long days of work. Stephenson possessed an extraordinary talent for understanding machines. He watched carefully, asked questions, and rarely accepted that something could not be improved. Before long, mine owners trusted him to maintain and repair their steam engines, knowing he had a remarkable ability to solve mechanical problems. At the time, horses still pulled nearly every wagon along the mine railways. Steam engines remained fixed in place, but few believed they could reliably move themselves. Stephenson was not so certain. He believed that if a steam engine could be made lighter, stronger, and more dependable, it could replace horses altogether. In 1814, while working at Killingworth Colliery, he built one of his first successful locomotives. It was not elegant. It was noisy, slow, and covered in soot, but it accomplished something remarkable. It pulled loaded coal wagons under its own power. The locomotive was named Blücher, after a famous Prussian general. While it travelled at only a few miles per hour, it demonstrated that steam engines could haul heavy loads along iron rails without the help of horses. There was still much room for improvement. Early locomotives frequently broke down. Some insisted that locomotives would require gears or even mechanical legs to climb hills. Stephenson disagreed. Through repeated experiments, he demonstrated that the simple weight of the locomotive pressing its smooth wheels against smooth rails created enough friction for the job. It seems obvious today, but at the time it answered one of the biggest questions surrounding railway technology. As more mines adopted steam locomotives, interest began spreading beyond the coalfields. Could railways carry more than coal? Could they transport ordinary people? Many remained skeptical. Some worried that passengers would never trust these noisy machines. Others feared that travelling at speeds of 20 miles per hour might somehow harm the human body. Doctors and newspapers occasionally speculated that such rapid movement could make it difficult to breathe or even damage one's health. Looking back, those fears seem almost amusing, but whenever a completely new technology appears, uncertainty often travels alongside excitement. Stephenson remained focused on building better engines. Plans were underway to build a railway connecting the towns of Stockton and Darlington. The region produced enormous quantities of coal, and mine owners needed a more efficient way to transport it to market. Many expected the railway to rely mainly on horses. Stephenson argued that steam locomotives were the future. After much debate, his vision prevailed. On September 27, 1825, the Stockton and Darlington Railway officially opened. Crowds gathered along the route, eager to witness an event unlike anything they had ever seen. At the front of the train stood Stephenson's locomotive, Locomotion Number 1. With a cloud of white steam rising into the morning sky, the engine slowly began to move. Behind it rolled wagons loaded with coal, flour, and several passenger carriages filled with excited travellers. Thousands watched as the train gathered speed. For the first time, a public railway powered primarily by steam locomotives had carried both freight and passengers over a considerable distance. The age of the railway had truly begun. Yet Stephenson was not finished. Only a few years later, another ambitious railway was proposed between two of Britain's busiest cities, Liverpool and Manchester. The project attracted enormous attention because many investors wanted to know which type of locomotive should power it. To answer that question, a competition was organized in 1829. It became known as the Rainhill Trials. Several inventors entered their locomotive designs, each hoping to prove that theirs was the fastest, strongest, and most reliable. George Stephenson entered a locomotive built with the help of his son, Robert. Its name was Rocket. Compared with earlier engines, Rocket looked surprisingly modern. It featured a tall chimney, angled cylinders, and an innovative boiler that produced steam far more efficiently than previous designs. During the competition, Rocket consistently outperformed its rivals. It proved not only that steam locomotives could travel quickly, but that they could do so reliably over long distances. The victory convinced many remaining skeptics. Railways were no passing curiosity. They represented the future of transportation. Soon afterward, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway opened to the public. Regular passenger trains began operating on a schedule, connecting two major cities in ways that would have seemed almost miraculous only a generation earlier. People could now travel faster than ever before. Merchants shipped goods more efficiently. Letters arrived sooner. Communities once separated by long days of difficult travel suddenly felt much closer together. Standing beside the tracks, observers could hardly believe how quickly the world was changing. The hiss of steam, the rhythmic turning of iron wheels, the whistle echoing across green fields. These sounds, once entirely unfamiliar, were becoming part of everyday life. George Stephenson could never have known just how far his ideas would travel. Within a few decades, railways would spread across Europe, North America, Asia, and beyond, carrying millions of passengers and transforming nations. But every great journey begins with a single departure, and on those early British railways, with determined engineers, curious crowds, and a handful of remarkable locomotives, humanity had finally climbed aboard. With the success of George Stephenson's locomotives and the opening of Britain's first modern railways, something remarkable began to happen. People started to imagine possibilities that had once seemed impossible. Travellers imagined visiting places they had only read about. Farmers saw opportunities to sell fresh produce farther from home, while factory owners dreamed of reaching new customers across the country. The railway was no longer an experiment. It was becoming a promise. As the 1830s unfolded, new railway proposals appeared almost weekly. Engineers surveyed valleys, crossed rivers, and climbed rolling hills, searching for the best routes between growing towns. Newspapers eagerly reported each announcement, while investors gathered in meeting halls to discuss ambitious new lines that would connect cities large and small. It was the beginning of what historians would later call railway mania. The word mania may sound dramatic, but it captures the excitement of the time. Railways inspired enormous optimism. Many believed they represented not just a useful invention, but the very future of society. Money flowed into railway companies at an astonishing pace. Ordinary shopkeepers purchased shares alongside wealthy landowners and successful merchants. Some invested carefully after studying maps and engineering plans. Others simply feared missing out on what seemed like an endless opportunity. Parliament received thousands of applications requesting permission to build new railways. Not every railway would ultimately be built, but during those years it sometimes seemed as though every town hoped to have a station of its own. Meanwhile, the countryside itself began to change. Construction crews spread across Britain, carrying shovels, picks, wheelbarrows, and enormous determination. These workers became known as navvies, short for navigators, a name originally used for the labourers who dug canals before many turned their skills toward railways. Long before modern excavators or bulldozers existed, nearly everything was accomplished by hand. Navvies dug deep cuttings through hills so trains could maintain gentle gradients. They piled earth into towering embankments that carried tracks across low ground. They built bridges over rivers and roads. Perhaps their greatest achievements were the tunnels. Standing before a steep hillside, engineers no longer accepted that a mountain or ridge marked the end of the journey. Instead, they chose to go straight through. Hundreds of workers chipped away with hammers and chisels, blasted rock with carefully placed explosives, and hauled away countless tons of earth. Progress was often measured in only a few feet each day. Months became years. Eventually, light appeared at the far end. For travelers passing through those finished tunnels, the journey lasted only moments. Few could fully appreciate the years of labor hidden within those dark passages. The stations rising along the new railways became places unlike any the world had seen before. Some were modest wooden buildings with a single platform and a small waiting room warmed by a coal stove. Others grew into magnificent structures with soaring roofs of iron and glass, sheltering dozens of trains beneath vast ceilings flooded with daylight. Each station developed its own rhythm. Porters stacked luggage onto handcarts. Ticket clerks carefully wrote out tickets by hand. Station masters adjusted clocks with remarkable precision. Vendors sold newspapers, sandwiches, tea, and fresh pastries to passengers waiting for the next departure. Every arriving train brought unfamiliar faces. Every departing train carried new stories. The railway was quietly making the country feel smaller. A trip that had once required several exhausting days by stagecoach might now take only a few comfortable hours. Families visited relatives more often. Businesses expanded beyond their local markets. Students traveled to universities, and tourists explored seaside towns that had once seemed impossibly distant. Even time itself began to change. Before railways, each town often kept its own local time based on the position of the sun. Noon simply meant the moment the sun stood highest overhead. Since towns lay at different longitudes, their clocks rarely agreed exactly. For generations, this caused little concern. But railways depended upon precise schedules. If two trains traveled toward one another on the same track, even a small difference in time could create confusion. Railway companies gradually adopted a single standard based on the time kept in London at the Royal Observatory in Greenwich. Station clocks were carefully synchronized. Passengers learned to trust railway time. Eventually, much of Britain adjusted its clocks to match, giving rise to the standardized timekeeping we still rely upon today. Of course, not everyone welcomed the changes. Some farmers worried that railways would divide their fields. Others disliked the noise of passing locomotives or feared sparks from steam engines might frighten livestock. A few people simply preferred the quieter pace of the old roads. Yet as each new railway opened, public enthusiasm continued to grow. Watching a steam train arrive became an event in itself. Children eagerly counted the carriages as they rolled past. Adults admired the polished brass fittings, gleaming driving wheels, and towering plumes of white steam rising into the sky. The whistle echoed across fields where only birdsong had been heard before. The ground gently trembled. Then, just as quickly, the train disappeared over the horizon. By the middle of the 19th century, thousands of miles of railway stretched across Britain. Cities that had once felt isolated were connected by ribbons of iron, while countless villages found themselves linked to the wider world for the very first time. The railway had become more than a machine. It was becoming part of everyday life. Morning commuters hurried to platforms. Mail trains departed after sunset. Farmers loaded fresh milk onto freight wagons before dawn. Holidaymakers packed trunks for seaside vacations, confident they could arrive before nightfall. The nation had learned to move in a new way, and Britain was only the beginning. Across the Atlantic, another young nation watched these remarkable developments with great interest. Its cities lay farther apart, its landscapes stretched for thousands of miles, and its ambitions were just as vast. Before long, railroads would begin crossing an entirely different kind of frontier, reshaping a continent unlike any the world had ever seen. By the middle of the 19th century, railways had become an ordinary part of life for many people in Britain. What had once attracted curious crowds simply to watch a locomotive pass was now something thousands experienced every day. Let us imagine that we are among those travelers. It is an early autumn morning in the 1840s. A faint layer of fog rests over the rooftops as you make your way through the quiet streets toward the local railway station. Long before you reach the entrance, you hear the familiar sounds of the railway. A distant whistle, the soft hiss of escaping steam, the rhythmic clank of metal couplings as railway workers prepare another train for departure. The station itself is already awake. Porters in neat uniforms push wooden carts piled high with trunks and parcels. A stationmaster, wearing a dark coat and polished hat, walks confidently along the platform, occasionally checking the large clock mounted beneath the station roof. Unlike today, there are no electronic displays announcing arrivals or departures. Instead, information is posted on printed boards or called out by railway staff. Your first task is purchasing a ticket. You step up to a small wooden window where the ticket clerk sits behind stacks of papers, ledgers, and neatly organized fare charts. After telling him your destination, he carefully writes your ticket by hand or stamps it using a heavy metal press. Coins change hands, the ticket is tucked safely into your pocket, and you are officially ready to travel. For many people, simply owning a railway ticket still feels remarkable. Only a generation earlier, long-distance travel had been reserved mostly for merchants, wealthy families, or those whose work demanded it. Railways did not make travel free, but they made it far more accessible than stagecoaches had ever been. Soon, a whistle sounds. Your train has arrived. The locomotive stands at the front, quietly breathing clouds of white steam into the cool morning air. Fire glows faintly inside the firebox as the engineer and fireman prepare for departure. Behind the engine stretches a line of passenger carriages. Not every carriage is the same. The railway reflects the social customs of Victorian Britain, where travel is divided into different classes. First-class passengers enjoy the greatest comfort. Their compartments feature upholstered seats, polished wood paneling, curtains, and sometimes even carpets. The ride is smoother, quieter, and more spacious. Second-class accommodations are comfortable enough, but simpler, with fewer decorations and firmer seating. Third-class passengers often travel on plain wooden benches. In the earliest years of rail travel, some third-class carriages had little protection from wind or rain. Though conditions gradually improved, these inexpensive tickets remained the most affordable option for working families. Once aboard, passengers settle into their compartments. Unlike many modern trains with long central aisles, Early railway coaches often consist of separate enclosed compartments entered directly from the platform. The guard walks the platform one final time. Doors are closed. A green flag rises. The engineer answers with a sharp whistle. Then comes a gentle tug. The train begins to move. At first, almost imperceptibly. Outside the window, the station platform slips away. Familiar buildings gradually give way to fields, hedgerows, and quiet country lanes. Soon the train reaches a steady pace. For many first-time passengers, the sensation is unlike anything they have ever experienced. Instead of bouncing endlessly over rough roads, the carriage glides with surprising smoothness along iron rails. The sounds quickly become familiar. The steady puff of the locomotive, the click-clack of wheels passing over rail joints, the faint rattle of windows, the distant whistle announcing level crossings or approaching stations. It is a rhythm that seems almost musical. Passengers pass the time in different ways. Some read newspapers or novels by the light filtering through the windows. Others quietly admire the passing scenery. Conversation flows easily among strangers, particularly on longer journeys where companions may share several hours together. Outside, the countryside unfolds like a moving painting. Stone cottages appear among green fields before disappearing behind gentle hills. Sheep graze peacefully in fenced pastures. Farmers pause briefly from their work to watch the train pass. Church steeples rise above distant villages, while rivers sparkle beneath graceful stone bridges. For many travelers, these changing landscapes are as enjoyable as the destination itself. Longer trips occasionally require refreshments. Large stations become lively places where passengers stretch their legs while locomotives take on fresh coal and water. Vendors sell tea, sandwiches, meat pies, fruit, and newspapers. Porters hurry between platforms carrying luggage, while station clocks quietly remind everyone that departure time is never far away. Punctuality becomes one of the railway's greatest virtues. Passengers learn that trains leave according to schedule, not according to who has or has not arrived. Missing a departure by even a minute may mean waiting hours for the next service. This reliability slowly changes people's habits. Meetings are arranged with greater precision. Business appointments become easier to keep. Families begin planning holidays around printed timetables. The railway teaches society to think in hours and minutes rather than broad estimates of morning or afternoon. As daylight fades, lamps inside the carriages are lit, casting a warm glow over fellow travellers. Outside, the countryside grows quiet beneath the evening sky. Villages sparkle with scattered lanterns, while the locomotive's smoke disappears into the darkness above. Eventually, the brakes gently slow the train. The familiar sounds soften. The platform comes into view. Porters wait beside neatly stacked luggage carts as the stationmaster raises his lantern in greeting. Your journey has come to an end. You step onto the platform having travelled farther, faster, and more comfortably than almost anyone could have imagined only a few decades earlier. For countless passengers, these railway journeys became unforgettable memories. But elsewhere, across the Atlantic Ocean, an even greater challenge awaited. There lay a nation of immense forests, towering mountains, endless prairies, and vast deserts, a land where railroads would soon attempt something the world had never before witnessed. The crossing of an entire continent. Next, let's travel across the Atlantic. Unlike Britain, America is vast. Cities are separated by hundreds of miles. Thick forests cover much of the east. Great rivers wind through fertile valleys, while beyond them lie rolling prairies that seem to stretch without end. Farther west rise towering mountain ranges, followed by deserts, canyons, and finally the Pacific Ocean. For those living here, distance shapes nearly every aspect of daily life. A letter from New York to the frontier might take weeks to arrive. Families moving westward travel by wagon for months, crossing rough trails that test both people and animals. The nation is expanding faster than its transportation system can keep pace. In the eastern states, stagecoaches continue carrying passengers along rough roads, while canals, especially the famous Erie Canal, provide an efficient route for freight. Rivers remain essential highways, with steamboats carrying people and cargo wherever the water flows. Yet none of these methods can fully connect such an enormous country. Many Americans begin paying close attention to the railways developing across Britain. If steam locomotives can transform one island nation, perhaps they can help unite an entire continent. The first railroads in the United States are modest by later standards. In the 1830s, short stretches of track connect nearby towns, ports, and factories. Some railroads still rely partly on horses, while others begin experimenting with steam locomotives imported from Britain or built by American engineers. At first, these railroads serve local needs. Another transports coal from a mine. A third links neighboring towns that once required an exhausting day's journey by wagon. But every successful railway encourages another. Before long, dozens of independent railroad companies are laying track across the eastern states. Travelers quickly discover the advantages. Instead of spending days bouncing along muddy roads, they can ride comfortably through forests and farmland at speeds that seem astonishing for the time. Freight moves more reliably, businesses grow, and communities that once felt isolated begin welcoming visitors from distant places. The railroad is becoming a symbol of progress. New stations appear almost overnight. Wherever tracks reach, change often follows. Small villages become busy trading centers. Hotels open beside stations to accommodate travelers. General stores expand their inventories because goods arrive more frequently. Blacksmiths, carpenters, merchants, and farmers all find new opportunities created by the steady arrival of trains. Sometimes entirely new towns appear where none had existed before. A railroad company selects a convenient location for a station, perhaps near a water source or an important crossroads. Soon a depot is built. Then comes a warehouse, a hotel, a few homes. Within a few years, a thriving community has taken root beside the tracks. Across the eastern United States, railroads begin shaping the map itself. Building these railroads is no easy task. Surveyors are usually the first to arrive. Carrying chains, compasses, notebooks, and simple measuring instruments, they walk mile after mile through forests, across rivers, and over rolling hills. Their task is to find the gentlest possible route, avoiding steep slopes whenever they can. Behind them come hundreds of laborers. Armed with axes, shovels, picks, and wheelbarrows, they clear trees, level ground, and build embankments. Bridges rise over creeks and rivers, while wooden trestles carry tracks across valleys. Every mile requires countless hours of labor. The work is demanding, but there is also a sense of excitement. Many workers understand they are helping create something that will outlast them. The locomotives themselves begin evolving as well. American railroads face challenges different from those in Britain. Tracks often cross rougher terrain and cover far greater distances. Engineers adapt by designing larger locomotives with stronger suspensions, larger smokestacks, and distinctive cowcatchers mounted at the front to clear obstacles from the rails. Water towers and wood piles appear at regular intervals along the routes. Steam locomotives are hungry machines. Every few dozen miles they must stop to replenish their water tanks and fuel supplies. These brief pauses become familiar moments in long-distance travel as passengers stretch their legs while crews prepare for the next stage of the journey. Life aboard American trains develops its own character. Passengers gaze through the windows as forests gradually give way to open farmland. Small wooden stations appear every few miles, each with its own water tower, telegraph office, and stationmaster waiting beside the track. Inside the cars, conversations begin easily. Some travelers are merchants heading to growing cities. Others are families seeking new opportunities farther west. There are farmers, teachers, craftsmen, ministers, and immigrants who have crossed oceans only to begin another journey across an unfamiliar land. The railroad brings together people who might otherwise never have met. Alongside the tracks, another remarkable invention quietly joins the railroad. The telegraph. Wooden poles carrying thin wires begin following the rail lines across the countryside. Messages that once required days of travel can now be transmitted in minutes using patterns of electrical signals. Railroads and telegraphs become perfect partners. Station masters communicate with one another to coordinate train movements, improving both efficiency and safety. Businesses receive news more quickly. Families exchange messages across increasing distances. Together, rails and wires begin shrinking the country in ways that would have seemed impossible only a generation earlier. Yet despite all this progress, one enormous challenge remains. Most railroads still serve only the eastern half of the nation. Far beyond the last station lie thousands of miles of open prairie, towering mountains, and vast deserts separating the Atlantic from the Pacific. Crossing those landscapes by wagon can take half a year or more. Many wonder whether a railroad could ever span such an immense distance. The idea sounds almost unbelievable. To build a railway from one ocean to the other would require crossing rivers wider than many towns, mountains higher than any yet encountered, and empty landscapes where supplies themselves would be difficult to obtain. It would become one of the greatest engineering projects of the 19th century, and it would forever change the story of America. The railroad had spread steadily across the eastern United States, bringing new life to towns and transforming the way Americans traveled. Yet one extraordinary challenge still remained: the continent itself. Between the established cities of the East and the growing communities along the Pacific coast stretched nearly 2,000 miles of prairie, desert, mountains, rivers, and open wilderness. The idea of building a railroad across such an immense landscape seemed almost impossible. Even experienced engineers wondered whether it could truly be done. During the 1860s, two railroad companies accepted the challenge. The Central Pacific Railroad would begin in Sacramento, California, building eastward toward the Sierra Nevada mountains. The Union Pacific Railroad would begin farther east, in what is now Nebraska, building westward across the Great Plains. Somewhere in the middle, the two lines would eventually meet. The race had begun. Construction started on opposite sides of the continent, and each company faced entirely different obstacles. For the Union Pacific, the first miles crossed broad prairies that seemed to stretch endlessly beneath enormous skies. Summer heat baked the earth. Winter storms swept across the plains with astonishing force. Rivers interrupted the route, requiring sturdy bridges before tracks could continue. Supplies had to travel long distances simply to reach the construction crews. Still, progress was steady. Teams of workers developed a remarkably efficient routine. Iron rails were laid across ties and secured with heavy spikes driven into place by powerful swings of steel hammers. Meanwhile, the Central Pacific faced a very different challenge. Almost immediately, its workers encountered the Sierra Nevada mountains. These towering granite peaks rose thousands of feet into the sky, covered in dense forests and blanketed with deep snow during the winter months. Building a railway through them demanded extraordinary determination. Thousands of workers, many of them Chinese immigrants, became the heart of the Central Pacific's construction crews. Leaving families behind, they traveled across the Pacific Ocean seeking opportunity in California. They quickly earned a reputation for remarkable skill, discipline, and perseverance. Working 6 days each week, they cleared forests, blasted tunnels through solid granite, and carried supplies into places where wagons could scarcely travel. To carve tunnels through the mountains, crews drilled holes into solid rock by hand using hammers and steel chisels. Black powder, and later the more powerful explosive nitroglycerin, was carefully placed inside the holes before everyone retreated to a safe distance. After the blast, workers returned to remove broken stone. Then they began drilling once more. Sometimes progress measured only inches each day. Winter brought even greater difficulties. Snowstorms buried camps beneath towering drifts. Avalanches swept down mountain slopes without warning. Entire work crews sometimes spent days digging themselves free before construction could continue. Yet they pressed onward. To protect future trains from heavy snowfall, engineers built long wooden snow sheds over portions of the track. These covered structures acted like tunnels made of timber, shielding locomotives from drifting snow and falling ice. Far to the east, the Union Pacific relied heavily upon Irish immigrants, Civil War veterans, and laborers from many different backgrounds. Life in the construction camps followed a simple routine. Workers rose before sunrise. Breakfast was hearty, often including bread, beans, meat, and strong coffee. Then came a full day of lifting rails, swinging hammers, digging earth, or tending horses. As evening arrived, campfires flickered across the prairie. Meals were shared, stories exchanged, and musicians occasionally filled the air with familiar songs before another day's work began. The camps themselves became temporary communities. Blacksmiths repaired tools. Cooks prepared meals. Doctors treated injuries. Supply wagons arrived carrying everything from food to fresh boots. Where thousands of workers gathered, entire little towns briefly appeared before moving onward with the advancing railroad. As the years passed, the distance separating the two railroads steadily shrank. Newspapers across the country eagerly reported their progress. Many Americans followed the construction almost as one might follow a great sporting event, wondering which company would lay more miles of track each week. Finally, in the spring of 1869, the moment everyone had been awaiting arrived. The two railroads met at a place called Promontory Summit in northern Utah. On May 10th, workers, engineers, railroad executives, journalists, and curious spectators gathered for a ceremony unlike any before it. A special golden spike had been prepared to symbolize the completion of the railroad. As dignitaries stepped forward, telegraph wires connected to the ceremonial hammer carried the news across the nation almost instantly. With the final blows, the last rail was joined. For the first time in history, a continuous railroad stretched from the Atlantic side of the United States to the Pacific coast. The journey that had once required many exhausting months by wagon could now be completed in roughly a week. The achievement captured imaginations around the world. Families traveled more easily between east and west. Businesses expanded into new markets. Mail arrived with unprecedented speed. Goods flowed across the continent in quantities that had once seemed unimaginable. The railroad did more than shorten distances. It changed how people thought about the country itself. Places that had once seemed unimaginably far apart suddenly felt connected by a ribbon of steel stretching across mountains, plains, rivers, and deserts. Even today, it is difficult not to admire the scale of what those workers accomplished. Armed with little more than determination, hand tools, horses, and steam-powered machinery, they completed one of the greatest engineering projects of the 19th century. As our train rolls westward across those very rails, passing through quiet valleys and climbing gentle grades once carved by thousands of determined hands, it is worth remembering that every mile carries the story of the people who built it. Their work helped unite a continent. But railroads were not transforming only America. Across the oceans, new railways were appearing on nearly every continent, connecting nations, opening frontiers, and quietly changing the lives of millions more. Outside the window, the landscape slowly changes. The familiar fields and forests of one country fade into unfamiliar scenery. Mountains rise in the distance. Rivers wind through valleys. Small villages appear beside the tracks, their station lamps glowing softly as the train passes through. This is the remarkable thing about railways. They do not simply move across landscapes. They transform them. After the success of the first great railways in Britain and the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States, nations around the world began looking toward railways as symbols of progress and connection. A railway was more than a line of steel. It was a promise that distant communities could become neighbors. Across continents, governments and engineers began imagining their own great railway projects. In Canada, the challenge was especially enormous. The country stretched across thousands of miles, with the Atlantic Ocean on one side and the Pacific Ocean on the other. Between them stood vast forests, endless prairies, and the towering Rocky Mountains. For much of the 19th century, many communities in Western Canada remained separated from the growing cities of the East. A transcontinental railway seemed almost impossible. Yet in the late 1800s, the Canadian Pacific Railway began the ambitious task of connecting the country from coast to coast. Workers pushed westward across the plains, where the landscape seemed endless beneath the open sky. They built bridges over rivers, carved passages through mountains, and laid thousands of miles of track through challenging terrain. The Rocky Mountains presented one of the greatest obstacles. Engineers searched for routes through narrow valleys and steep passes, carefully designing curves and grades that steam locomotives could handle. When the railway was completed in 1885, it represented far more than a transportation achievement. It helped shape Canada itself. Far across the world, another nation was attempting a railway project of even greater scale. Russia. The Russian Empire stretched across one of the largest continuous land areas on Earth. From Moscow to the Pacific Ocean, the distance was staggering. In the late 19th century, Russian leaders dreamed of a railway that would cross Siberia, connecting the western part of the empire with distant eastern territories. The Trans-Siberian Railway became one of history's greatest railway journeys. Construction began in 1891, and workers faced an extraordinary environment. Siberia was beautiful, but it was also harsh. Thousands of workers labored along the route, building bridges, tunnels, and stations across a landscape that seemed almost endless. The finished railway stretched more than 5,000 miles from Moscow to Vladivostok. Even today, riding the Trans-Siberian Railway remains one of the world's most famous rail journeys. 4 days, the train becomes a moving home, carrying travelers across a continent while following the same path first imagined more than a century ago. In India, railways arrived during the 19th century and became one of the largest railway systems in the world. At first, railways primarily served economic and administrative purposes, helping transport goods and resources across the country. But over time, they became deeply woven into everyday life. Stations became gathering places. Trains carried families visiting relatives, students traveling to schools, merchants transporting goods, and countless passengers beginning new chapters of their lives. India's railways expanded across deserts, plains, forests, and mountains. Engineers built impressive bridges and mountain routes that demonstrated remarkable creativity. The railway became a familiar part of daily life for millions of people. In Australia, trains faced a different challenge. The continent's interior was vast, dry, and often difficult to cross. Settlements were scattered along the coast, while the centre of the country remained remote. Railways helped connect distant communities and supported the movement of agricultural products, minerals, and supplies. One of Australia's most famous railway journeys, the Gone, eventually crossed the continent from north to south, travelling through landscapes of extraordinary beauty. Passengers watched the scenery change from tropical regions to red desert plains, experiencing the immense scale of the Australian landscape from the comfort of a railway carriage. South America also embraced railways as nations sought ways to connect cities, ports, and resource-rich regions. In the Andes Mountains, engineers faced some of the most dramatic terrain on Earth. Railways climbed steep slopes, crossed deep valleys, and reached elevations where thin air and difficult conditions challenged both workers and machines. Everywhere railways appeared, they brought change. A small farming village might become a busy market town. A remote mine could suddenly send resources to distant cities. A family separated by hundreds of miles could now plan a visit without weeks of preparation. The arrival of the railway often marked the beginning of a new era. But railways were not only about economics and transportation. They also changed how people experienced the world. A journey itself became part of the adventure. Travelers watched unfamiliar landscapes unfold outside their windows. They crossed regions they had only heard about. They met strangers from different communities and cultures. The train became a place where countless stories began. A young person leaving home for the first time. A family moving toward a new opportunity. A traveler seeking adventure in a distant land. A worker following the tracks toward a new job. Each passenger carried a different reason for boarding, but all shared the same experience of motion and discovery. By the beginning of the 20th century, railways had become one of humanity's greatest achievements. They stretched across continents. They connected oceans. They carried millions of people and countless tons of goods. They helped nations grow, cities expand, and cultures interact in ways that previous generations could never have imagined. Yet behind every railway map and every impressive bridge were ordinary people, the engineers, workers, station employees, and passengers who brought these networks to life. And as our train continues into the distance, following rails that cross borders and landscapes, we begin to understand something important. Railways did not simply follow the growth of nations. In many ways, they helped create them. Trains have become a symbol of adventure, a symbol of progress, a symbol of a world growing smaller with every mile of track. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, steam locomotives had reached a level of beauty and power that few could have imagined when the first experimental engines rolled through British coalfields. This was the golden age of steam. Across Europe and North America, railway companies competed to build faster, larger, and more comfortable trains. Locomotives grew bigger and more powerful, capable of pulling long lines of passenger coaches across entire countries. The steam locomotive itself became a source of fascination. For many people, the train station was a place of excitement. It was where journeys began. Large stations became some of the most impressive buildings in the cities they served. Their enormous iron and glass roofs created bright, open spaces where hundreds of passengers could gather beneath the sound of arriving trains. Inside, everything seemed to move with careful purpose. Steam drifted beyond the platforms, creating an atmosphere that felt almost magical. As railway networks expanded, passenger travel became increasingly comfortable. The earliest trains had been simple, sometimes uncomfortable carriages designed mainly for practicality. But competition encouraged companies to improve the experience. Seats became softer. Carriages became warmer. Windows became larger, allowing passengers to better enjoy the passing scenery. Long-distance trains began offering amenities that made journeys feel less like transportation and more like an experience. One of the greatest innovations was the sleeping car. Before sleeping compartments became common, overnight travel was difficult. Passengers attempted to rest sitting upright in their seats. Sleeping cars changed everything. Designed with foldable beds and private sleeping areas, they allowed travelers to journey overnight while arriving refreshed the next morning. In the United States, George Pullman became famous for creating luxurious sleeping cars that transformed long-distance travel. His designs included comfortable beds, elegant interiors, and attentive service, making train journeys feel remarkably sophisticated. The golden age of steam was also the golden age of railway dining. Long-distance travelers could enjoy meals while watching landscapes roll past their windows. Dining cars featured tables covered with white cloths, polished silverware, and carefully prepared meals served by dedicated staff. A journey across a continent could include breakfast among mountains, lunch beside endless plains, and dinner beneath the evening sky. Some railways took luxury even further. In Europe, famous trains such as the Orient Express became symbols of elegance and mystery. Traveling between major cities, these trains offered beautifully decorated compartments, fine dining, and a sense of romance that captured the imagination of travelers around the world. The idea of stepping aboard a train and crossing international borders while surrounded by comfort and sophistication felt almost like a dream. But not all famous trains were about luxury. Many were celebrated because of the incredible landscapes they crossed. The California Zephyr carried passengers through the dramatic scenery of the American West, passing through mountain ranges, deep canyons, and wide valleys. The Flying Scotsman connected London and Edinburgh, becoming one of Britain's most famous express trains. Across the world, countless named trains developed loyal passengers who looked forward not only to reaching their destination but to experiencing the journey itself. Behind every remarkable train was a remarkable locomotive. Steam engines continued to evolve throughout this period. Engineers designed larger boilers to create more power. Driving wheels became carefully sized depending on whether a locomotive needed speed or pulling strength. Improved brakes, stronger frames, and better mechanical systems made trains safer and more reliable. Some locomotives became famous in their own right. They were given names, polished carefully, and admired almost like works of art. Railway workers often developed deep pride in their engines. The engineer and fireman working inside the locomotive cab became a familiar image of the railway age. Their jobs required skill, attention, and experience. The engineer controlled the massive machine, carefully managing speed, pressure, and the route ahead. The fireman worked beside the boiler, shoveling coal into the fire and ensuring the engine had the steam it needed. Together, they formed a partnership with the locomotive. They understood its sounds. They recognized its movements. They knew when something was not quite right simply by listening. For communities located along railway lines, the passing train became part of the daily rhythm of life. Children waited near tracks, hoping to wave at engineers. Farmers checked schedules before bringing goods to market. Residents used the whistle as a familiar marker of time. Morning trains arrived. Evening trains departed. The railway was woven into everyday routines. Yet the golden age of steam was not only about speed or luxury. It was about connection. A train ticket represented possibility. It meant seeing a place you had never visited, meeting people you had never known, beginning a new chapter somewhere beyond the familiar horizon. For millions of people, Railways opened doors that had once remained closed. Immigrants traveled toward new homes. Workers traveled toward new opportunities. Families crossed great distances to reunite. Tourists discovered landscapes they had only dreamed of seeing. The train carried all of them. By the early 20th century, steam railways had reached their peak. Their networks covered continents. Their locomotives had become engineering marvels, and their passenger cars represented some of the finest examples of travel ever created. But even at the height of this remarkable era, another transformation was quietly approaching. New technologies were beginning to appear. Electricity was changing cities. Automobiles were becoming more common. Airplanes were taking their first uncertain flights. The steam locomotive still ruled the rails, but the future was already beginning to arrive. For now, though, let us remain beside the tracks for just a little longer. Listen to the distant whistle. Watch the great engine disappear into the evening mist. And remember the age when the world traveled beneath clouds of steam. The story of trains is often told through famous locomotives, impressive bridges, and record-breaking journeys. But behind every train that arrived safely at its destination were thousands of people whose daily work kept the railway alive. They were the station masters who watched over quiet depots, the engineers who guided powerful locomotives through changing landscapes, the conductors who checked tickets and cared for passengers, the mechanics who repaired machines before dawn, the signal operators who watched carefully from small towers beside the tracks. Together, these workers created the complex world of the railroad. For many communities, the station master was one of the most important people in town. The station master kept schedules organized, handled messages, supervised employees, and ensured that trains arrived and departed safely. In small towns, the station master often knew nearly everyone who passed through. The station was not just a transportation stop. It was a gathering place, a place where news arrived, a place where people said hello, a place where communities connected with the wider world. Nearby, inside the locomotive cab, another important relationship existed: the engineer and the engine. Operating a steam locomotive required experience and careful attention. The engineer needed to understand the pressure gauges, control the speed, watch the tracks ahead, and respond quickly to changing conditions. The fireman worked beside him, tending the fire that created the steam needed to move the train. This was physically demanding work. The fireman's day was spent near intense heat, repeatedly shoveling coal into the roaring firebox. The quality of the fire determined how smoothly the locomotive performed. Over time, skilled crews developed an almost personal understanding of their locomotives. They recognized familiar sounds, a slight change in the rhythm of the machinery, a different vibration beneath their feet, a noise that suggested something needed attention. A good engineer could often sense a problem before it became serious. Behind the scenes, mechanics and repair crews worked constantly to keep the railway moving. Railroad workshops were busy places filled with the sounds of hammers, tools, and machinery. A locomotive might travel hundreds of thousands of miles during its lifetime, but only because countless hours of maintenance kept it running. Track crews walked along miles of railway inspecting rails, tightening bolts, replacing damaged sections, and clearing debris. Their work required patience and attention to detail. A railway could only be as reliable as the tracks beneath it. In the early days of railroads, much of this inspection was done on foot. Snow, rain, heat, and darkness were simply part of the job. Another essential role belonged to signal operators. Before modern technology, keeping trains safely separated required careful communication. Small signal stations appeared beside railway lines, often containing levers, clocks, and communication equipment. Inside these quiet rooms, operators watched the passing trains and controlled signals that told engineers when it was safe to continue. Their work required constant concentration. A missed message or incorrect signal could have serious consequences. The telegraph became one of the railway's greatest tools. Operators could send messages along the line, allowing stations to communicate quickly across great distances. For the first time, railways had a nervous system. Information could travel almost instantly, coordinating movements across entire networks. Another familiar figure from the railway age was the conductor. Passengers often knew the conductor best because he was the person they encountered during their journey. Wearing a distinctive uniform, the conductor moved through the train checking tickets, answering questions, and helping passengers find their seats. On long journeys, conductors became familiar faces. They helped travelers navigate unfamiliar routes and often provided information about upcoming stops. They knew the schedules, the stations, and the landscape outside the windows. They were guides as much as employees. Railroads also created opportunities for many other workers. Porters carried luggage. Cleaners prepared passenger cars. Cooks worked in dining cars. Clerks managed paperwork. Telegraph operators sent messages. Carpenters built and repaired structures. Blacksmiths shaped tools and parts. Thousands of people depended upon the railway industry for their livelihoods. Entire towns developed around railroad work. Some communities grew beside major repair shops where hundreds of employees maintained locomotives and cars. Others became important junctions where multiple railway lines met. Railroads shaped not only geography but also daily routines. A town with a railway station lived according to the rhythm of trains. Morning arrivals. Afternoon departures. Evening mail service. The distant whistle of a locomotive became as familiar as the sound of church bells. For children growing up near the tracks, trains represented wonder and adventure. Many spent hours watching locomotives pass, memorizing the shapes of different engines and counting the cars in each train. The railway offered a glimpse of a larger world beyond their hometown. Every passing train carried stories from somewhere else. A businessman returning from a distant city. A family visiting relatives. A traveler beginning an adventure. A shipment of goods from a place many residents would never see. The railroad brought the wider world closer. Yet perhaps the most remarkable thing about life along the railway was the sense of shared purpose. Building and operating a railroad required cooperation between thousands of people. Engineers, workers, station employees, and passengers all depended upon one another. A train journey that appeared simple from the outside was actually the result of countless careful efforts. Every whistle, every departure, every safe arrival represented the work of many hands. As our own train moves quietly into the evening, passing through towns that grew beside the tracks, we can imagine the people who once filled these stations and workshops. The station master checking his clock. The engineer preparing the locomotive. The conductor welcoming passengers aboard. The workers maintaining the rails beneath them. They were the people who transformed railroads from machines into living communities, and their work allowed the great railway networks of the world to continue expanding into the landscapes ahead. Tracks must maintain careful grades and gentle curves. Bridges must support enormous weight. Tunnels must provide a safe passage through solid mountains. Every mile of railway represents a conversation between human imagination and the natural world. The greatest railway achievements came from engineers who looked at seemingly impossible landscapes and asked a simple question: how can we cross this? For the earliest railways, flat and open land was ideal. But as networks expanded, engineers quickly reached places where nature seemed determined to stop them. Each presented a different challenge, and each required a different solution. One of the most common obstacles was the simple problem of elevation. Steam locomotives were powerful machines, but they could not climb steep slopes easily. Unlike a person walking uphill or a horse pulling a wagon, a locomotive depended on the careful relationship between its wheels and the rails beneath them. A track that rose too quickly could leave a train struggling or unable to continue. Because of this, engineers searched for routes that climbed gradually. Sometimes this meant creating enormous winding paths that slowly gained elevation across a mountainside. In mountainous regions, engineers developed creative solutions. One approach was the use of switchbacks. Instead of traveling directly uphill, the railway would move back and forth across a slope, gradually climbing higher with each turn. Another solution was the spiral railway, where tracks curved around themselves, allowing trains to gain altitude while traveling through a relatively small area. These designs were not only practical, they were often beautiful. Bridges became one of the greatest symbols of railway engineering. Early bridges were often made from wood, but as locomotives grew heavier and trains became longer, stronger materials were needed. Iron and steel allowed engineers to create structures capable of carrying enormous loads across rivers and valleys. Engineers studied the strength of materials, measured water levels, considered weather patterns, and designed foundations that could withstand years of pressure. Some bridges stretched across enormous distances. Others rose hundreds of feet above the ground. Perhaps nothing demonstrates railway ambition more clearly than tunnels. A mountain that once marked the end of a journey could now become simply another part of the route. But creating a tunnel was one of the most difficult tasks imaginable. Before modern drilling equipment existed, workers carved passages through rock using hand tools and explosives. Progress was slow and exhausting. Teams worked from both ends of a mountain, carefully measuring their direction and hoping they would meet in the middle. A mistake of only a few feet could mean disaster. Inside these tunnels, conditions were often uncomfortable. Air was poor. Temperatures could be extreme. Dust filled the passageways. Workers spent years underground, slowly creating paths that future travelers would pass through in only a few minutes. When the final connection was made and sunlight appeared at the far end, it was a moment of celebration. A mountain had been conquered. Railways also faced challenges from the weather. Snow was one of the greatest enemies of mountain routes. Heavy storms could bury tracks beneath enormous drifts, bringing entire railway lines to a stop. To solve this problem, engineers built snow sheds. These long wooden or stone structures covered sections of track, protecting trains from falling snow and avalanches. From inside a passing train, passengers might see only a dark wooden tunnel. But outside, these structures stood as silent guardians against the power of winter. In desert regions, engineers faced a different set of problems. Water became the greatest concern. Steam locomotives required enormous amounts of water to operate, and long stretches of dry landscape offered few natural sources. Railroad companies built water towers and supply stations along remote routes, creating small islands of civilization across otherwise empty terrain. Workers also had to consider heat. Tracks expanded in high temperatures, requiring careful construction techniques to prevent bending and damage. The desert itself became part of the engineering challenge. Even forests created obstacles. Dense woodlands had to be cleared before tracks could be laid. Trees were cut, stumps removed, and the ground leveled. In wet regions, engineers built drainage systems to prevent water from weakening the track foundations. Nothing could be ignored. A railway demanded attention to every detail. One of the most impressive examples of railway engineering came from mountain railways, where tracks climbed through some of the highest and most dramatic landscapes on Earth. In Switzerland, engineers built railways through the Alps, creating routes that carried passengers past glaciers, cliffs, and breathtaking valleys. These lines required tunnels, bridges, and carefully designed routes that seemed almost impossible when construction began. The result was more than transportation. It was a way for people to experience landscapes that had once been nearly unreachable. Looking back, railway engineering was not simply about building machines. It was about understanding the world. Engineers studied geology, weather, physics, and geography. They learned how materials behaved under pressure and how landscapes changed over time. Every bridge, tunnel, and track represented thousands of decisions. A small adjustment here, a stronger foundation there, a better design based on lessons learned from previous attempts. The railway became one of humanity's greatest examples of cooperation between imagination and nature. And perhaps that is why trains remain so fascinating. A locomotive moving through a mountain pass feels almost like a quiet miracle. A massive machine gliding safely over a bridge. A passenger looking through a window at a valley far below. A train disappearing into darkness before emerging into sunlight on the other side of a mountain. All of it made possible by people who refused to accept that the landscape was too difficult to cross. As our train continues forward, following rails carved through places once considered unreachable, we can appreciate the hidden stories beneath every mile. Because every railway journey is also a journey through human determination. And the tracks ahead will carry us toward another essential part of railway history. The trains that quietly carried the goods, resources, and materials that helped build the modern world. Imagine standing beside a railway yard in the early morning. The sun is just beginning to rise. A thin layer of mist rests over the tracks. In the distance, a locomotive slowly approaches, not carrying travelers with luggage or families heading toward new adventures. This train carries something else. Coal, timber, grain, steel, food, materials that will become the foundation of growing cities and industries. These are freight trains. Often less glamorous than luxury passenger trains, freight trains have always been among the most important parts of the railway story. Without freight railways, much of the modern world as we know it would never have developed. The earliest railways were built largely because of freight. The ability to move enormous amounts of material efficiently was what first made railways so valuable. Coal was one of the most important. During the Industrial Revolution, coal-powered factories, heated homes, and fueled steam engines themselves. As cities grew, their demand for coal increased dramatically. A single freight train could carry hundreds of tons of coal from distant mines to cities and ports. Instead of relying on countless wagons pulled by horses, industries could receive steady supplies delivered directly along the rails. Coal trains became a familiar sight across industrial regions. Timber was another essential resource moved by rail. As towns expanded, they required enormous quantities of wood for homes, buildings, furniture, and countless other uses. Forests located far from major cities suddenly became valuable sources of material because railroads could transport their products over great distances. Logging communities often developed alongside railway lines. Workers cut trees deep in the forests, processed the lumber, and loaded it onto waiting freight cars. The train then carried those heavy loads toward growing towns and cities. Agriculture was also completely transformed by freight railways. Before widespread rail networks, farmers were limited by how far they could transport their products before they spoiled or became too expensive to move. Railroads changed that. A farmer in a rural community could now send grain, livestock, dairy products, and other goods to distant markets. Entire agricultural regions developed because farmers knew they could reach customers hundreds or even thousands of miles away. The American Midwest became one of the world's great farming regions partly because railroads connected its fields to expanding cities. Harvests that once remained local could now feed growing populations across the continent. One of the most important innovations in agricultural transportation was the refrigerated rail car. Before refrigeration, transporting fresh meat, fruits, and vegetables over long distances was extremely difficult. Many foods spoiled before reaching their destination. Refrigerated cars changed everything. By keeping freight cold during transport, railroads allowed fresh products to travel farther than ever before. A person living in a distant city could enjoy foods that had been grown or produced hundreds of miles away. The railway was quietly changing what people ate. Another important freight industry was livestock transportation. Large numbers of cattle, sheep, and other animals could be moved by rail from ranches and farms to processing centers. Special livestock cars were designed with ventilation and feeding systems, allowing animals to travel more safely and efficiently. These trains became an essential link between rural producers and urban populations. Manufacturing also depended heavily on freight railroads. Factories needed raw materials arriving on schedule. Iron ore traveled to steel mills. Cotton traveled to textile factories. Machines, tools, and manufactured goods traveled outward to customers. The railroad connected every stage of production. A factory was no longer limited by what existed nearby. It could draw resources from distant places and sell products across entire nations. This created a new level of economic growth. Rail yards became some of the busiest places in industrial cities. Hundreds of freight cars moved through these enormous networks, being sorted, connected, and redirected toward different destinations. Railroad workers developed complex systems to organize the movement of goods. Switch operators guided cars onto different tracks. Engine crews moved trains between yards. Dispatchers coordinated schedules. Every movement had to be carefully planned. Unlike passenger trains, which followed clear routes and schedules, freight trains often required complicated arrangements because every shipment had different needs. Some cargo needed refrigeration. Some required special equipment. Some trains carried materials that had to be delivered quickly. The freight railroad was a massive moving puzzle. Yet behind all this activity was a simple purpose: connecting places. A shipment of grain from a distant farm, coal from a mountain mine, lumber from a northern forest, steel from an industrial city. All of these journeys became possible because of the rails beneath them. Freight trains also helped create entirely new industries. Mining operations expanded because companies knew they could transport valuable resources to market. Towns grew around railroad junctions. Ports became busier as trains delivered goods from inland regions. The railway did not simply serve economic growth. It encouraged it. In many ways, freight trains were the quiet engines behind national development. Passenger trains carried stories and memories, but freight trains carried the materials that shaped everyday life. The buildings people lived in, the products they used, the food they ate, the fuel that warmed their homes. All were connected in some way to the movement of goods along railway lines. Even today, when we see a long freight train passing in the distance, it can be easy to overlook what it represents. Each car has a purpose. Each shipment has a destination. Each journey is part of a much larger network that stretches across countries and continents. The modern world depends upon the quiet movement of these trains. As our own historical train rolls onward, leaving the busy freight yards behind, we begin to understand that railways were never only about travel. They were about connection. They carried people, but they also carried possibility. And soon, we will return to the passenger side of the railway world, where trains became more than transportation. They became some of the most luxurious and memorable journeys ever created. Next, we are boarding a different kind of train. One where polished wood lines the walls, where soft lamps glow above comfortable seats, where the sound of wheels on the rails becomes a gentle rhythm accompanying fine meals, quiet conversations, and the changing scenery outside the window. This is the era of luxury railway travel. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, trains became more than a way to reach a destination. For many travelers, the journey itself became the destination. Railway companies understood that comfort and elegance could make train travel even more appealing. As competition grew, companies began designing passenger cars that offered experiences unlike anything that had existed before. The train was no longer simply a machine. It was a moving hotel, a restaurant, a private retreat traveling across the countryside. Long-distance journeys that once required discomfort and uncertainty became opportunities for relaxation and discovery. Imagine arriving at a grand railway station on a cool evening. Your destination may be hundreds or even thousands of miles away. But there is no need to hurry. The train will carry you while you rest. You step aboard your sleeping carriage. Inside, the atmosphere is calm and elegant. The narrow hallway is lined with polished wood. Behind each door is a small private compartment designed to provide comfort during the long journey ahead. As evening arrives, seats are transformed into beds. Curtains are drawn. Passengers settle in for the night as the train continues through the darkness. The invention of sleeping cars completely changed long-distance travel. Before they became common, overnight journeys could be exhausting experiences. Passengers attempted to rest sitting upright, often arriving tired after many hours on the rails. One of the most famous names associated with luxury rail travel was George Pullman. In the United States, Pullman developed passenger cars designed around comfort and elegance. His sleeping cars featured upholstered seating, private sleeping areas, mirrors, carpeting, and attentive service. It was a chance to experience a level of comfort usually associated with fine hotels rather than transportation. The Pullman Company also introduced another important figure to railway history, the sleeping car porter. These workers helped passengers throughout their journeys, preparing sleeping areas, assisting with luggage, and providing personal service. Their work became an essential part of the luxury train experience. Before their introduction, passengers often had to bring their own food or purchase meals during brief stops at stations. But as journeys became longer, railways began creating dedicated dining spaces where travelers could enjoy meals while the landscape moved past their windows. Servers moved between tables as passengers enjoyed breakfast, lunch, or dinner while traveling through changing scenery. The landscape became part of the dining experience. Some trains became famous not only for comfort, but for the destinations they connected. Perhaps the most legendary was the Orient Express. Beginning service in 1883, the Orient Express connected major European cities, carrying passengers between places such as Paris, Vienna, and Istanbul. The journey represented adventure and sophistication. Travelers crossed international borders while enjoying elegant accommodations, fine dining, and the feeling of exploring a world that seemed both distant and accessible. The train became a symbol of romance and mystery. It inspired countless stories and captured the imagination of people who dreamed of traveling across Europe in style. In Britain, the Flying Scotsman became one of the world's most famous express trains. Connecting London and Edinburgh, it represented speed, reliability, and engineering excellence. For passengers, It provided a comfortable connection between two major cities while showcasing the remarkable capabilities of modern steam locomotives. In North America, famous passenger routes crossed landscapes of breathtaking variety. The California Zephyr carried travelers through the American West, passing through mountains, deserts, and deep valleys. Large windows allowed passengers to appreciate scenery that had once been accessible only to explorers and adventurers. For many people, a railway journey became a way to experience nature. A passenger could wake up beside one landscape and fall asleep beside another entirely different world. Forests, rivers, mountains, prairies, all slowly passing beyond the window. Luxury trains also changed the way people thought about vacations. Before widespread rail travel, visiting distant destinations was often difficult and expensive. Railways made tourism possible on a much larger scale. Coastal resorts became popular because visitors could now reach them easily. Mountain towns welcomed travelers seeking fresh air and beautiful scenery. National parks gained new visitors who arrived by train, eager to experience landscapes they had previously only seen in photographs. The railway helped create the idea of the modern vacation. Yet the appeal of luxury trains was not only about comfort. It was about the feeling of adventure. A train journey offered a rare opportunity to slow down and observe the world. Unlike airplanes, which quickly carry passengers above the landscape, trains remain connected to the ground. They pass through small towns, follow rivers, cross bridges, and move through places that would otherwise remain unseen. The journey unfolds gradually. There is time to watch, time to think, time to appreciate the changing scenery. For many travelers, that was the true magic of the railway. As the 20th century progressed, new forms of transportation began competing with trains. Automobiles offered personal freedom, and airplanes promised incredible speed. But the romance of the railway never completely disappeared. Even today, people are drawn to historic rail journeys and luxury trains because they offer something rare: a slower way to experience the world. A chance to watch landscapes unfold 1 mile at a time. A reminder that reaching the destination is only part of the adventure. So as our own train continues into the evening, let us settle back into our comfortable seat. The lamps glow softly. The wheels keep their steady rhythm. Outside, the countryside drifts past beneath the stars. And somewhere ahead, another station waits. Another landscape begins, and another chapter of railway history is ready to unfold. The railway did not simply connect cities. It helped create them. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, railroads became one of the most powerful forces behind urban growth. They brought people, materials, and ideas together, allowing cities to expand in ways that earlier generations could hardly have imagined. Before railways, cities were limited by distance. Most people lived close to where they worked because traveling long distances each day was difficult. Factories needed to be located near rivers, ports, or sources of power. Markets were often limited to nearby communities. The railway changed these limitations. The modern city began to take shape. Railway stations became some of the most important buildings in urban areas. They were often the first places visitors saw when arriving in a city, and many communities wanted their stations to reflect ambition and progress. Architects designed enormous structures with grand entrances, towering ceilings, and impressive halls filled with natural light. Inside, crowds moved in every direction. Business travelers carried briefcases. Families carried luggage. Tourists studied maps. Workers hurried toward the city streets. The station was a place of constant movement. Outside the station doors, entire neighborhoods developed around the railway. Hotels appeared to accommodate travelers arriving from distant places. Restaurants and shops opened to serve passengers waiting for trains. Warehouses and businesses settled nearby because easy access to transportation was valuable. Railways shaped the geography of cities. Industrial districts often grew beside tracks because factories needed direct connections to freight lines. Warehouses, workshops, and manufacturing plants clustered around railway yards where materials could be loaded and unloaded efficiently. The sound of industry became part of urban life. The distant whistle of locomotives, the rumble of freight cars, the ringing of bells at railroad crossings. For many city residents, these sounds marked the rhythm of everyday life. Railroads also changed where people lived. As cities became larger and more crowded, many workers began seeking homes outside the busiest urban centers. Passenger trains and commuter railways allowed people to live farther from their workplaces while still traveling into the city each day. This created the beginnings of suburbs. Communities once considered too distant from city life became accessible. Homes could be built beyond crowded streets, while workers still maintained jobs in urban centers. The idea of commuting, traveling regularly between home and work, became increasingly common because of the railway. For the first time, people could separate where they lived from where they worked. This changed the shape of cities forever. Railways also encouraged immigration and population growth. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, millions of people arrived in new countries seeking opportunities. Many entered through major ports before traveling inland by train toward growing cities and new communities. Railways helped newcomers reach places where jobs and opportunities were available. Cities became meeting places of different cultures, languages, and traditions. Neighborhoods formed around shared backgrounds and experiences. New restaurants, businesses, and cultural institutions appeared, creating the diverse urban environments that many cities are known for today. The railway also transformed commerce. Large department stores, once difficult to supply, could now receive goods from across the country. Farmers and manufacturers could send products directly to urban customers. A city resident could purchase items produced hundreds or thousands of miles away. Clothing from distant factories, food from faraway farms, materials from remote mines and forests. The railway connected everyday life to a much larger world. The growth of cities also created new challenges. Crowded neighborhoods developed quickly, sometimes faster than city planners could respond. Streets became busy with pedestrians, horses, wagons, streetcars, and trains. Finding efficient ways to move people around increasingly crowded cities became a major concern. Railways themselves became part of the solution. Elevated railways appeared in some cities, carrying trains above busy streets. Underground railways were developed in places where surface space became limited. These systems allowed thousands of people to move quickly through growing urban areas. Public transportation became an essential part of city life. In many ways, the railway changed people's relationship with time and distance. A person living outside the city could still participate in urban life. A business owner could communicate with partners far away. A family could visit relatives in another region. A newspaper could report events from distant places more quickly than ever before. The world felt increasingly connected. Yet perhaps the most lasting impact of railways on cities was the way they changed people's imagination. Before railroads, many people lived their entire lives within a relatively small area. The places beyond their hometowns existed mostly as stories. The railway changed that. Now, distant places became reachable. A mountain valley was no longer just a place on a map. A coastal town was no longer an impossible journey. A large city was no longer a distant mystery. The railway invited people to explore. It encouraged movement. It created curiosity about what existed beyond the familiar horizon. By the beginning of the 20th century, railways had become inseparable from urban life. They carried workers into cities each morning. They delivered supplies to businesses. They connected neighborhoods. They welcomed travelers. They helped transform small communities into major centers of culture, industry, and innovation. The modern city grew alongside the railway. And even today, many of the world's greatest cities still follow the paths created by those early tracks. As our train slows near the glowing lights of a city, we can imagine the countless passengers who once arrived here with hopes, dreams, and destinations ahead. Some came for work. Some came for adventure. Some came seeking a new beginning. The railway brought them all together. But as the 20th century progressed, the world around the tracks began to change. New machines appeared. New technologies emerged. And the age of steam, which had dominated the rails for generations, slowly began making room for a new era. By the early 20th century, the world around the railway was beginning to change. New inventions were appearing. New sources of power were being explored. And slowly, another chapter of railway history was beginning. The age of steam was approaching its twilight. The first challenge came from within the railway world itself. Steam locomotives were incredible machines, but they had limitations. They required enormous amounts of coal and water. Before every journey, crews needed to prepare the engine carefully. Fire had to be built, pressure had to be raised, and mechanical parts had to be inspected. A steam locomotive was powerful, but it demanded constant attention. Railway companies began searching for alternatives. One possibility was electricity. Electric trains had existed in small experiments since the late 19th century, but improvements in electrical technology gradually made them more practical. Unlike steam engines, electric locomotives did not need to carry fuel or water. They could accelerate quickly, operate quietly, and produce fewer emissions. However, electric railways required something expensive. Infrastructure, power lines, electrical systems, and specialized equipment had to be built along the routes. This made electrification easier in busy cities and difficult on long rural routes. Some railways embraced electricity. Others continued using steam because existing systems were already established and reliable. Another competitor appeared in the form of the diesel locomotive. Diesel engines offered many advantages. They could be started quickly. They required less maintenance. They could operate for long periods without stopping for water. At first, many railway companies were uncertain about diesel power. Steam locomotives had decades of history behind them. Engineers, workers, and passengers were familiar with them. But gradually, diesel technology improved. The balance began to shift. The change was especially noticeable after the Second World War. Across North America and Europe, railway companies began replacing aging steam locomotives with diesel engines. Many steam locomotives had worked for decades, and maintaining them became increasingly expensive. Diesel trains were simply more practical for many routes. The transition was not sudden. For years, steam and diesel locomotives worked side by side. A passenger might see a modern diesel engine waiting beside an older steam locomotive, representing two different eras meeting at the same station. The change was emotional for many railway workers and enthusiasts. Steam locomotives were more than machines. They had personalities. Workers knew their engines by sound and appearance. Engineers developed deep connections with the locomotives they operated. Many took pride in maintaining these powerful machines and keeping them running smoothly. To some, replacing steam engines felt like the end of a tradition. The disappearance of steam was not only a technological change. It was the closing of a chapter. Across the world, communities that had grown alongside steam railways watched familiar sights slowly disappear. The clouds of smoke above the tracks became less common. The sound of steam whistles faded. The massive engines that had once seemed unstoppable were gradually moved into museums, abandoned yards, or quiet corners of railway history. Yet the steam locomotive never truly vanished. Many were preserved because people recognized their importance. Historic railways restored old engines and brought them back to life. Enthusiasts repaired forgotten locomotives, polished their metal surfaces, and carefully maintained the machines that had once powered the world. Today, when a restored steam locomotive rolls down the track, it carries more than passengers. It carries memory. It reminds people of a time when travel felt slower, more deliberate, and connected to the physical world around them. The end of steam also reflected a larger transformation happening across society. The 20th century introduced new ways of moving people and goods. Automobiles became increasingly common. Highways connected cities. Airplanes made long-distance travel faster than ever before. The railway was no longer the only symbol of modern transportation. Yet trains adapted. Passenger railways focused on comfort, efficiency, and speed. Freight railways remained essential for moving enormous quantities of goods. New technologies allowed trains to become faster, safer, and more reliable. The railway did not disappear. It evolved. One of the most important developments was the rise of high-speed rail. Beginning in the mid-20th century, countries began experimenting with trains designed to travel far faster than traditional passenger trains. Japan led the way with the introduction of the Shinkansen, often called the bullet train, in 1964. These trains demonstrated that railways could compete with airplanes for certain types of travel. They offered remarkable speed while maintaining the comfort and convenience that made trains unique. Other nations followed, developing their own high-speed networks. The railway had entered a new era. But even as technology advanced, something about trains remained unchanged. They still connected people. They still transformed landscapes. They still offered a different way of experiencing the world. A passenger on a modern train may not hear the same sounds as someone traveling during the steam age, but the feeling of movement remains familiar. Watching the landscape pass outside the window. Seeing towns and countryside connected by a ribbon of steel. Feeling the gentle motion of the train carrying you forward. The railway's greatest achievement was never just speed. It was connection. For generations, trains carried people toward opportunities, reunions, discoveries, and new beginnings. They helped build cities. They opened frontiers. They brought distant places closer. And even after the great steam locomotives disappeared from everyday life, the spirit of the railway continued. As our historical train slows beneath the fading light, we leave behind the era of steam. The great engines that once filled the sky with smoke have become legends, but their legacy remains in every track, every station, and every journey that follows. The age of steam may have ended. The age of the railway did not. For most of railway history, trains were limited by the power of their engines, the strength of their tracks, and the challenges of the landscapes they crossed. But as technology advanced during the 20th century, engineers began asking a new question. How fast could a train truly travel? The answer would transform the future of transportation. The story of high-speed rail begins in Japan. After the Second World War, Japan was rebuilding its economy and its cities. The country had a growing population, limited land, and increasingly crowded transportation routes. The railway between Tokyo and Osaka was especially important. Millions of people traveled between these major cities, but traditional trains struggled to keep up with demand. Japanese engineers began imagining a completely new kind of railway, a train designed from the beginning for speed. Instead of simply improving existing tracks, they created an entirely separate railway system. The tracks would be straighter, the curves would be gentler, and the trains would be designed specifically for high-speed travel. The result was the Shinkansen, which began service in 1964. When the first bullet trains began carrying passengers between Tokyo and Osaka, they represented a remarkable achievement. They traveled at speeds far beyond ordinary passenger trains. The world took notice. The Shinkansen proved that railways were not a technology of the past. They could still represent the future. One of the most impressive features of high-speed rail was not simply speed itself, but the way trains maintained comfort while traveling quickly. Passengers did not need to travel long distances to reach airports outside urban areas. They could arrive at a station, board their train, and quickly find themselves traveling toward another city center. This convenience became one of high-speed rail's greatest advantages. Following Japan's success, other countries began developing their own high-speed networks. In France, engineers created the TGV, or Train à grande vitesse. Beginning service in the early 1980s, the TGV connected major French cities with remarkable speed and efficiency. Its sleek design and powerful electric engines demonstrated what modern rail technology could achieve. The TGV became a symbol of French engineering. Journeys that once required many hours by conventional train became much shorter. Business travelers could visit distant cities and return home the same day. Tourists could explore multiple regions without needing flights. High-speed rail encouraged people to think differently about distance. Across Europe, railway networks became increasingly connected. A person could begin a journey in one country, pass through several others, and arrive at a distant destination without ever leaving the railway network. The train became a bridge between cultures. Germany developed its own high-speed trains with the Intercity Express, commonly known as ICE. These trains combined speed with the focus on engineering and reliability. They connected major cities across the country and became an important part of European transportation. Spain, Italy, South Korea, and China also developed advanced high-speed railway systems. Each country adapted the technology to its own geography and transportation needs. Some routes crossed crowded urban regions. Others traveled across enormous distances between major cities. In China, high-speed rail expanded at an extraordinary pace during the 21st century. The country built one of the world's largest high-speed networks, connecting cities separated by hundreds or even thousands of miles. A journey that once required a full day of travel could often be completed in only a few hours. The expansion of high-speed rail demonstrated one of the railway's oldest qualities: the ability to reshape how people understand distance. A place that once felt far away could suddenly feel nearby. A city that required careful planning to visit could become accessible for a weekend trip. A business meeting separated by hundreds of miles could become a simple day journey. High-speed rail changed the rhythm of modern life. Yet building these systems required extraordinary engineering. High-speed trains demanded carefully designed tracks. Small imperfections that might not matter at slower speeds could become significant when trains traveled at hundreds of miles per hour. Railways required advanced signaling systems to monitor trains and maintain safe distances. Bridges and tunnels had to be built with incredible precision. Even the shape of the train itself became important. Engineers designed streamlined noses to reduce air resistance. Smooth surfaces helped trains move efficiently through the air. Every detail contributed to speed and performance. The result was a machine that seemed almost futuristic. But despite all the technology, high-speed trains preserved something familiar. They remained connected to the ground. Passengers could still watch landscapes unfold outside their windows. They could see towns, rivers, forests, and mountains pass by. They could experience the journey itself. This was something airplanes could not completely replace. The railway offered a different relationship with travel. It allowed passengers to move quickly while remaining connected to the places they crossed. High-speed rail also became an important part of conversations about the future of transportation. As cities grew and concerns about energy use increased, many looked toward railways as an efficient way to move large numbers of people. Modern trains could carry hundreds of passengers while using less space than highways filled with automobiles. They represented a connection between the railway's long history and its future possibilities. Looking back across the centuries, the transformation is remarkable. The first steam locomotives moved slowly along short stretches of track. Then came continent-spanning railways, luxury passenger trains, powerful freight systems, electric trains, and now, trains that move faster than many early railway pioneers could have imagined. Yet the purpose remains the same. Connection. Every railway, from the smallest rural line to the fastest train in the world, exists to bring places and people closer together. As our high-speed train glides smoothly into the distance, the landscape outside becomes a blur of motion. Fields become streaks of green. Cities appear and disappear. The horizon seems to move closer, and somewhere ahead, another station waits. Another destination. Another chapter in the endless story of the railway. For nearly 2 centuries, railways have been more than a method of transportation. They have become part of our culture. They appear in paintings, songs, novels, movies, and childhood memories. Few inventions have captured the human imagination quite like the railway. From the very beginning, trains inspired artists and writers. When the first locomotives appeared in the 19th century, many people viewed them with a mixture of excitement and curiosity. These machines seemed almost impossible, great iron creations that could move faster than any horse and carry people farther than ever before. Artists began painting locomotives racing across the countryside. The railway became a symbol of the modern age. It represented movement, progress. For many people, a train journey represented a moment of transition. The railway was often the place where one chapter ended and another began. This idea appeared frequently in literature. Authors used trains as settings for stories because they naturally brought strangers together. Inside a railway carriage, people from different backgrounds could find themselves sharing a small space, creating opportunities for unexpected conversations and mysteries. The train became a perfect stage for human stories. A businessman sitting beside a traveler, a detective following a clue, a family moving toward a new beginning, a stranger carrying a secret. The movement of the train created a sense of anticipation. Something was always waiting ahead. One of the most famous examples of the train in literature is the mystery story set aboard a luxury railway journey. The closed environment of a train created a fascinating setting where characters could not simply leave whenever they wanted. The journey itself became part of the mystery. But trains appeared in many other kinds of stories as well. They represented adventure in children's books. They represented change in historical novels. They represented longing and separation in emotional stories. The railway became a universal symbol because almost everyone understood the feeling of watching a train depart. The world of music also embraced trains. Songs about railroads appeared across many cultures, especially in places where railway life shaped communities. The sound of the train inspired musicians. The rhythm of wheels moving along tracks naturally resembled musical patterns. The distant whistle of a locomotive became a sound associated with travel, distance, and memories of home. For workers, travelers, and communities living beside rail lines, trains became part of everyday life. Songs told stories about engineers, workers, travelers, and people searching for something beyond their current surroundings. The train often represented freedom, a way out, a path toward somewhere new. Visual artists were equally fascinated by railways. Painters captured locomotives emerging through clouds of steam, crossing bridges, and disappearing into distant landscapes. Photographers documented the changing relationship between people and machines. The contrast between powerful locomotives and peaceful natural scenery created images that remained memorable for generations. One of the most famous artistic themes was the meeting of technology and nature. A train crossing a vast valley. A locomotive passing through a snowy mountain landscape. A railway disappearing toward the horizon. These images reflected a larger idea, the human desire to explore and connect the world. The railway also became deeply connected to cinema. When motion pictures emerged in the late 19th century, trains were among the first subjects filmmakers captured. The simple image of a locomotive arriving at a station fascinated early audiences. Watching a train move on a screen created a sense of realism and excitement unlike anything people had experienced before. Some early viewers were even rumored to have reacted with fear when they saw a locomotive appearing to move toward them on screen. Whether exaggerated or not, the story reflects something important. Trains felt powerful. They represented movement in a way that audiences had never seen before. As movies developed, trains became common settings for adventure, romance, comedy, and suspense. The railway offered endless possibilities for storytelling. A train could be a place of escape, a place of danger, a place where strangers met, a place where the future could change in a single conversation. The image of a train traveling through the wilderness became especially powerful in stories about exploration and the frontier. Railways represented the expansion of societies into new regions. They carried settlers, explorers, workers, and dreamers toward unfamiliar landscapes. In many stories, the train became a symbol of opportunity. But railways also inspired reflection. They reminded people of change. A train arriving in a small town could bring excitement, but it could also transform a community forever. Old ways of life changed as new connections appeared. Artists and writers explored both the promise and the challenges of progress. The railway was not only a machine. It was a force that reshaped human lives. Even today, trains continue to hold a special place in popular culture. Historic rail journeys attract travelers who want to experience the romance of earlier times. Model railroads remain a beloved hobby for people around the world. Children still imagine themselves as engineers guiding trains across miniature landscapes. The familiar sounds of rail travel continue to create a sense of comfort. The gentle movement, the steady rhythm, the view of landscapes passing beyond the window. There is something timeless about the railway experience. Perhaps this is because trains combine two things humans have always valued: movement and connection. They allow us to leave one place while remaining connected to the journey itself. Unlike many forms of modern transportation, Trains encourage passengers to notice the world around them. They remind us that travel is not only about arriving. It is also about experiencing the path between where we started and where we are going. As our train moves through the evening landscape, the lights of distant towns appear and disappear outside the window. Somewhere, another train follows another route. Another passenger begins another journey. Another story is waiting to be told. For nearly 200 years, railways have carried people across the world. But they have also carried dreams, memories, and imagination. The railway is not just a chapter in history. It is part of the human story itself. The story of trains is not finished. It is still being written. Today, railways are entering a new era shaped by technology, sustainability, and the changing needs of a growing world. Modern trains may look very different from the smoke-filled locomotives of the 19th century, but they continue to serve the same purpose: connecting people, moving goods, bringing distant places closer together. One of the greatest challenges facing transportation today is the need for efficiency. Cities are growing. Roads are becoming increasingly crowded. Communities are searching for ways to move more people while using fewer resources. Railways are once again being recognized as an important part of the solution. Modern passenger trains can carry hundreds of people at once, reducing the need for countless individual vehicles traveling along crowded highways. Freight trains can transport enormous quantities of goods with remarkable efficiency, moving products across countries while requiring fewer trips than traditional road transportation. The railway, an invention born during the Industrial Revolution, has found a place in the modern world. Technology continues to reshape trains in remarkable ways. Modern locomotives use advanced computer systems to improve safety and performance. Sensors monitor equipment, helping engineers identify potential problems before they become serious. Automatic systems assist with speed control and communication. Railway networks have become increasingly intelligent. A train today is not just a machine. It is part of a complex system involving computers, satellites, communication networks, and carefully coordinated operations. The future of rail travel may also involve new approaches to energy. For much of history, trains depended on coal and diesel fuel. But as societies look for cleaner forms of transportation, railways are exploring alternatives. Electric trains have already become common in many parts of the world. They offer quiet operation, impressive speed, and reduced emissions when powered by renewable energy sources. Some engineers are exploring even more advanced technologies. Hydrogen-powered trains have begun appearing in experimental and commercial service, offering another possible option for routes where traditional electric systems are difficult to install. The goal is not simply to make trains faster. It is to make them more sustainable. High-speed rail continues to expand as well. Around the world, countries are investing in faster connections between major cities. The idea remains the same as it was when the first railways appeared. Reduce the feeling of distance. Allow people to travel farther with greater ease. Create stronger connections between communities. Future high-speed trains may travel even faster, using improved designs and advanced technology to reduce resistance and increase efficiency. Some concepts explore magnetic levitation, known as maglev technology. Instead of traditional wheels rolling on rails, maglev trains use magnetic forces to lift and propel the train. By reducing friction, these trains can reach extraordinary speeds. Although widespread adoption remains limited, maglev demonstrates the continuing desire to push railway technology forward. Yet the future of railways is not only about speed. It is also about experience. Many passengers continue to choose trains because they offer something different from other forms of transportation. A train journey allows people to remain connected to the landscape around them. They can watch forests, mountains, rivers, and cities pass outside their windows. They can move comfortably while still experiencing the world they are traveling through. This connection between travel and scenery remains one of the railway's greatest strengths. Railways are also likely to remain essential for moving goods. As global trade grows, the need to transport materials efficiently becomes increasingly important. Freight railways continue to carry everything from agricultural products to industrial materials, supporting economies around the world. Future freight trains may become more automated, using advanced systems to improve safety and efficiency. But behind every technological improvement remains the same purpose that guided the earliest railways: moving what needs to be moved, connecting what needs to be connected. The railway's future will also depend on its relationship with cities. Urban populations continue to grow, and transportation systems must adapt. Modern commuter railways, subways, and regional trains help millions of people move through cities every day. Future cities may rely even more heavily on rail-based transportation as communities seek alternatives to crowded roads. The railway may once again help shape the cities of tomorrow. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about the future of trains is how closely it resembles the dreams of the past. The pioneers who built the first railways imagined a world where distance mattered less. They imagined communities connected by steel pathways. They imagined people traveling farther than ever before. Those dreams have become reality. A person today can board a train in one city and arrive hours later in another, crossing landscapes that once required weeks of travel. The railway has accomplished what its earliest inventors hoped it would do. It has changed the way humanity experiences distance. But perhaps the most enduring part of the railway story is not the technology. It is the human experience. Every train journey still carries the same emotions that passengers felt generations ago: the excitement of departure, the curiosity of seeing somewhere new, the comfort of a familiar route, the anticipation of arrival. A train station is still a place of beginnings and reunions. A railway line is still a path toward somewhere else. A passing train still makes people wonder where it came from and where it is going. As our own train continues forward, we look back at the incredible journey behind us. From the earliest wooden tracks of mining towns, to the first steam locomotives, to railways crossing continents, to luxury trains, freight networks, and high-speed marvels. Every chapter has shown the same truth. The railway changes with the world around it, but it never loses its purpose. The future may bring faster trains, cleaner technology, and more advanced systems. But the heart of the railway will remain unchanged. A journey, a connection, a path between places and people. And somewhere ahead, beyond the horizon, another train is already beginning its journey. As our journey through the history of trains begins to approach its final destination, let us slow down and look back along the tracks behind us. The railway we know today is the result of countless generations of imagination, effort, and determination. It began with simple ideas: a way to move heavy materials, a way to travel farther, a way to connect places that once seemed impossibly distant. From those early dreams came one of humanity's most transformative inventions. The railway changed the world. It changed how people traveled. It changed how cities grew. It changed how industries operated. And perhaps most importantly, it changed how people understood distance. Before railways, the world was much larger. A journey across a country could take months. News from distant places arrived slowly. Communities remained isolated from one another. Many landscapes were known only through stories and maps. Then came the locomotive, a machine that could carry people and goods farther and faster than ever before. Suddenly, places that once felt unreachable became accessible. A person could leave their hometown and discover a new region. A farmer could send products to distant markets. A family could reunite across hundreds of miles. A city could grow beyond its previous boundaries. The railway created connections that transformed everyday life. Looking back at the earliest railways, it is remarkable to consider how much they changed. The first engines were small and experimental. They traveled short distances and seemed almost uncertain. But each improvement led to another. Stronger locomotives, better tracks, safer systems, longer routes. With every advancement, railways expanded their reach. They crossed valleys and mountains. They entered deserts and forests. They connected oceans and continents. The railway became one of the greatest examples of human ambition. But the story of trains has never been only about machines. It has always been about people. The engineers who designed impossible bridges. The workers who laid tracks through difficult landscapes. The mechanics who kept locomotives running. The station employees who welcomed travelers. The passengers who carried their hopes and dreams aboard each train. Every mile of railway represents human effort. Every station holds memories. Every journey carries a story. The railway has witnessed some of the most important moments in modern history. It carried immigrants toward new homes. It transported workers toward opportunities. It helped cities become centers of culture and industry. It carried soldiers during times of conflict and families during times of peace. It carried letters, supplies, and ideas. It carried the everyday movements of millions of ordinary lives. Often, the most important railway stories are not about famous trains or record-breaking speeds. They are about the quiet moments. A child waving at a passing locomotive. A traveler looking out a window at a landscape they have never seen. A family waiting on a platform for someone they have missed. A worker beginning a new job in a distant town. The railway has always been part of these small but meaningful moments. It has been woven into the lives of generations. Even as transportation has changed, the emotional power of trains has remained. Airplanes may travel faster. Cars may offer convenience. But trains continue to offer something unique. A connection to the journey itself. On a train, the world unfolds gradually. You can watch the landscape change. You can see cities become countryside. You can follow rivers through valleys and cross mountains that once seemed impossible to reach. The train allows passengers to experience the spaces between destinations. And perhaps that is why railways continue to inspire such fascination. They remind us that travel is not only about arriving somewhere. It is also about the path we take to get there. The railway's influence can still be seen everywhere. Modern cities continue to grow around railway stations. Freight trains continue moving essential goods across continents. High-speed trains continue shrinking distances between communities. Historic railways continue preserving the memories of earlier generations. The railway has adapted again and again because it has always served a fundamental human need, the need to connect. As we look toward the future, trains will continue changing. New technology will make them faster, cleaner, and more efficient. New systems will improve safety and reliability. New designs will create new possibilities. But the essential idea behind the railway will remain the same. A line connecting one place to another. A vehicle carrying people toward something beyond the horizon. A journey waiting to begin. The history of trains is ultimately a history of connection. It is the story of how humanity overcame distance, how mountains became pathways, how isolated communities became neighbors, how the world became smaller. From the first steam locomotives to the newest high-speed trains, every generation has added another chapter to this remarkable story. The railway is not just an invention. It is a reflection of human curiosity, a reminder that we have always looked beyond the familiar and wondered what lies ahead. So as our final train slows beneath the evening sky, we take one last look outside the window. The tracks stretch behind us through centuries of history, past old stations, past forgotten rail yards, past mountains, cities, and landscapes forever changed by the presence of the railway. Ahead, the tracks continue forward. There are still places to explore, still journeys to take, still stories waiting to be carried. Because the railway was never truly about the destination. It was about the movement, the discovery, the connection, and the endless journey forward. The age of trains continues. As our final journey through the history of trains comes to a gentle close, let us settle into our seat one last time. Outside the window, the landscape continues to move. Fields pass quietly beneath the fading light. Small towns rest beside the tracks. Distant mountains rise along the horizon. The wheels beneath us continue their familiar rhythm, carrying us forward just as they have carried countless travelers for generations. For nearly 200 years, the railway has been one of humanity's greatest journeys. It began with a simple idea: that people and goods could move farther, faster, and more efficiently than ever before. From the earliest steam engines that traveled across short stretches of track to the incredible high-speed trains of today, the story of the railway has been a story of imagination becoming reality. The first locomotives were strange and unfamiliar machines. To the people who first witnessed them, they seemed almost impossible. Iron wheels turning on iron rails. A powerful engine creating motion from steam and fire. A machine that could carry more than any horse, wagon, or ship traveling on inland routes. But what began as an experiment soon became a revolution. Railways transformed the world. They carried coal from mines to factories. They carried food from farms to cities. They carried materials that built growing nations. They carried passengers toward new places, new opportunities, and new experiences. The railway changed the way humanity moved. But more than that, it changed the way humanity connected. Before trains, distance created separation. A mountain range, a desert, or hundreds of miles of wilderness could divide communities for generations. Railways crossed those barriers. They created pathways through landscapes that once seemed impossible to overcome. They connected oceans. They connected cities. They connected people. The great railway builders of history were not only creating transportation systems, they were creating bridges between lives. Every railway line carried countless stories. A young person leaving home in search of a new beginning. A family traveling across a continent to build a different future. A worker riding the morning train toward a new job. A traveler looking out the window at a landscape they had only dreamed of seeing. The train was never just a machine. It was a doorway, a beginning, a chance to go somewhere beyond the familiar. The railway also changed the shape of the world around it. Cities grew beside stations. Industries developed near rail yards. Small communities became important centers of trade. Entire regions flourished because a railway line connected them to the wider world. The tracks did not simply follow history. They helped create it. Yet perhaps the most remarkable part of the railway story is that trains have always adapted. When steam locomotives reached their limits, new technologies emerged. Electric trains brought greater efficiency. Diesel locomotives offered flexibility and reliability. High-speed rail transformed the idea of distance. Modern trains use advanced technology that early railway pioneers could never have imagined. But despite all these changes, something important has remained the same. The feeling of a train journey. The quiet anticipation before departure. The sound of wheels meeting the rails. The view of landscapes slowly changing outside the window. The sense that somewhere ahead, something new is waiting. In a world that often moves faster every year, trains continue to offer something unique. They remind us to notice the journey itself. They allow us to watch the world unfold 1 mile at a time. They connect us not only to places, but to the experience of traveling between them. Perhaps that is why railways continue to inspire such fascination. A train represents movement, but also possibility. It represents the idea that there is always somewhere else to explore. Somewhere beyond the next station. Somewhere beyond the next horizon. As we look back along the tracks behind us, we see the incredible journey that brought us here. We see the first steam engines moving through quiet countryside. We see workers laying rails across continents. We see grand stations filled with travelers. We see luxury trains crossing nations in comfort. We see freight trains carrying the resources that built modern society. We see high-speed trains racing into the future. Each chapter of railway history is different, but every chapter shares the same theme: connection. The railway remains one of humanity's greatest reminders that progress is not only about moving faster. It is about bringing people closer together. It is about opening paths where none existed before. It is about looking toward the horizon and believing there is something worth reaching. So as our final train slows into the quiet of the evening, the lights of the station ahead begin to appear. The journey is ending, but the tracks continue. They stretch forward into the future, carrying new passengers, new stories, and new discoveries. Because the railway was never truly about where the train stopped. It was always about where it could take us. The history of trains is the history of movement. The history of connection, the history of humanity's endless desire to explore. And somewhere, beneath the stars, another locomotive begins its journey. The wheels turn. The whistle sounds softly in the distance. And the railway moves forward once again. Good night.